Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Jim Kurose, today's speaker in the ICS Distinguished Lecture Series. Dr. Kurose is the Assistant Director for the National Science Foundation, Computer and Information Science and Engineering Directorate, which is known as CISE. Managing an annual budget of more than $900 million, Jim leads CISE in its mission to uphold the nation's leadership in scientific discovery and engineering innovation by supporting fundamental research in computer and information science and engineering, state-of-the-art cyberinfrastructure, and education and workforce development. I stole that cut and paste from you.
It sounded familiar to me, actually.
Yes, I stick to the script. Dr. Kurose is on leave from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where he's distinguished professor in the College of Information and Computer Sciences. He previously served as Dean of the College of Natural Sciences at UMass Amherst. He has held visiting positions at IBM Research, INRIA, Institut Eurocom, the University of Paris, the Laboratory for Information, Network and Communication Sciences, and Technicolor Research Labs. He has served on national and international advisory boards and panels and has received numerous awards for his research and teaching in the area of computer networking. His talk today is entitled An Expanding and Expansive View of Computing. Jim, thank you for presenting to us today. We look forward to your talk.
Thanks. So I'm really happy to be here. When I was flying in, I think this is the 5th time I've been here, and I know it's the 3rd time I've been in this particular room talking. I think the last time was, actually this was the last place I visited before I joined NSF in December of 2014. I gave a technical talk then. Here I'm going to talk about NSF, and it's technical, but it's not my research. I'm going to tell you about NSF, but I'm really happy to be here and I have friends, former colleagues, and people that I've met over the years here, so that's really great. And I'm awed that I've got your Vice President for Research and your Provost here too, so that makes me a little bit nervous. Okay, so here's what I'd like to do. So I'm here really to talk about NSF, computer science more broadly, and what's going on in the CISE, Computer and Information Science and Engineering Directorate. So I should say I've been a faculty member for 34 years. I've been at the NSF for 3 years. So I think of myself much more as a teacher and a faculty member than I do a government person. So, let's pretend this is a class, and if there are questions and comments, I'll try to stop myself, because I could just start and go on and on and on and on and on and on, but you don't want that, right? So help save me from that. So I want to talk about computer science broadly, what's happening nationally. I'll talk about the CISE Directorate. I'll talk a little bit about our Programmatics, and then I want to look forward a bit. I may skip to the looking forward part a little bit early, because I know your provost has another appointment, and I want to make sure he sees one particular slide that I have here. I call it my provost slide. Okay? So if you were to ask anybody, what does NSF do? They will say, NSF funds science, and they would say, hopefully my science also. And this is actually from the Organic Act that established the National Science Foundation to promote the progress of science. So we are the only federal agency that broadly funds almost every area of science and engineering. So that's the beginning of what we do. What most people don't know is that there's additional text here to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. So we do that too. And that sort of leads to a point I want to make about the importance, especially in an area like computing, the importance of what we do to not just science and the science of computer science, but also to national health, prosperity, and welfare. And so when you think about the CISE Directorate, in the previous administration, we called these initiatives because initiatives sort of belong to administrations. But we do initiatives because they're important, because they're priorities. So these are some of the CISE programs that have been and continue to be national priorities. big data and artificial intelligence, I'll say more about that, cybersecurity, robotics, we're in the National Robotics Initiative version 2.0 now, understanding the brain, advanced cyber infrastructure, smart connected communities, computer science education. I'm going to say something about that, especially at K through 12 and the pipeline, and advanced wireless research. So these are some of the areas that, that we put particular emphasis on. Okay? Now, I'm going to show you when I teach, I always hope that like 2 or 3 months later, or maybe even 2 or 3 weeks later, students always remember 2 or 3 things that that we covered in class. So what I'm going to show you is actually something that I hope will be one of those 2 or 3 things that you all take away and remember 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months from now. And I want to ask, I know Pramod has seen this, how many people have heard of the tire tracks diagram? 1. Wow.
That's really bad.
Did you raise your hand?
No,
2. Okay, 2 people here. Okay.
I used it.
So this is a graphic that I use all the time. Part of my job, which I love, is talking to staffers and folks on the Hill, to Congress people, and to talk about the value of computer science to the nation. Okay, and this is embodied in what's called the tire track diagram, which is over here. And so I'm going to tell you what this tire track diagram shows. So this is a piece of it, and it talks about actually a very uniquely American ecosystem where academia, industry, and academia sort of fueled by the federal government and industry interact with each other. So I always tell my students, say what the axes are here. So here's time going up here, and you see 2 sets of tire tracks here. There's a red tire track, so I'll pick networking, that's my research area. In the 1970s, and actually even a little bit before that, research started in what became the internet many decades later. In the university, funded by federal government, primarily DARPA at that time. Here's when, in the 1980s, companies like Cisco got started. This green line shows, the thin green line is when it became a $1 billion industry, and the thick green line is when it became a $10 billion industry. And the important thing here is actually these little arrows going back and forth, because each of these is a case of a person, an artifact, a piece of hardware, and software, or paper that was written, something that moved from academia into industry, or from industry into academia. And you see this sort of flow back and forth between academia and industry, and growing industries, for example, too, right? And so this interaction, again, is something that's incredibly important in the ecosystem here in the United States. And if you've traveled and you understand sort of how things work in Asia and Europe, this is something that we really do really, really well here. And so this shows it for networking and software. And you can't read this. This comes from a National Academy of Sciences report, but it repeats again and again, from digital communications to architecture, software, networking, distributed systems, databases, AI, and robotics. And so this is one way that we talk about the value proposition for basic research in computer science, because it gives us, you can't see these companies, but 95% of them up top here. This is one of the really important things that comes out of the research, the basic research that we do in academia. So I hope you like that tire track diagram. When I show it to people in DC, it's sort of very visual, and they sort of get that. Now, this ends in 2010. You can't see it here. So I'm a networking person, and I will tell you, in the 1990s, when you wrote a proposal, you say, oh, I'm a networking person. We brought you the internet, and everybody would say, oh, wow. Okay, you've really proven your worth to us. By about 2000, people started saying, what have you done for me lately, right? And you could no longer, the sheen sort of wore off, and you had to sort of say all over again why what you're doing is so important. So this ends in 2010. So you might say, well, what have you done for me lately? So I have 2 slides, or 2 examples here. What have we done lately that's important? And so I know there you've got great people here doing machine learning. And so, for example, what we're doing in many of the advances that you're seeing now, really all over the pages of every paper on deep learning, a lot of those trace their roots back to work in reinforcement learning and other types of learning that was done with NSF funded and other federal research in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? So you again, look at this time scale, right? Sometimes it's decades-long time scale that we make these investments, but we really see, it takes a little bit of time to really mature and then become sort of an industry. And so this is one of my favorite quotes. This is from Eric Schmidt, who is the former CEO of Google and Alphabet. He was talking about NSF. He says, NSF, where all interesting research gets started. So we love that quote, of course, at NSF. This is actually a friend and a colleague of mine. So software-defined networking is grown to be a many multi-billion-dollar agency in just about a decade. And you can trace that back to NSF-funded research really in the 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9 timeframe. So yet again, another example. Okay, so one last thing, I'm still setting some context here. You're all living this, so I'm assuming everybody knows this here, but here's just sort of 3 sort of graphical measures of things that will sort of tell you what's happening in the field. So over the last 3 years, there's been a 107% increase in the number of tenure-track positions being advertised in academia in computer science. Now, those of you who are administrators know that tenure-track positions, matter of fact, those of you who are faculty know, this is the coin of the realm, right? That when universities invest in tenure-track faculty, they're investing for the long term, right? So this is really important. This graphic here is showing the increase, 115, 129, 75% the increase in enrollments in classes. So I'm sure you're all living that here. And part of this, of course, is all being driven by jobs and economic considerations. So this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It shows that if you look at where are the jobs, the new jobs plus replacement between 2014 and 2024, 55% of those are in computer occupations, right? And so sometimes I like to say I feel like Forrest Gump, because when I went into computer science, I don't want to say it was because I didn't make it as a physicist, because I made a very specific choice to go into computer science, but it was sort of a small little field, and I loved computer science. And I would tell you, my physics advisor said, "Are you crazy? Why are you going into computer science?" Well, I loved it. And now it feels like computing is at the center of so many different things that are happening.
Jim, those are STEM jobs, or that pie chart is?
So great question. So yes, these are STEM jobs. Let me just tell you, the numbers are 55% for computing, 26% for engineering. I think computer engineering is over here. 5% for life sciences, 4% for physical. So these are these are basically the NSF, because social sciences in there too. Okay, so I imagine many of you are computer scientists or computer and information scientists and engineers. So, I think all of this points to that it's an incredibly exciting and also impactful time to be working in our discipline. Okay, so I'm going to talk about size, but let me stop myself for a second. And any comments or questions so far for anything you've seen? Thank you.
Do you get you must make pitches to Congress.
I do.
With this data. Do you get a favorable response then?
I will tell you there's a huge amount. So the question was...
Bipartisan response.
Right. So I was just going to say that. The question was, what's the response on both sides of the aisle? And there's tremendous support. Actually, there's tremendous support for the National Science Foundation. Usually I go in and I talk about computer science. I've testified twice in the last year, once on quantum and once on artificial intelligence, and I will tell you, both sides of the aisle have tremendous amounts of support for computer science and for science and engineering more broadly. I think people get how important science and engineering is to the country. It's economic competitiveness, it's national security, it's health and welfare of the population, right? All those things that were actually in the Organic Act defining NSF. So really, it's nice to be in a field where generally, mostly what you get is love. So, if not quite as much money as we might hope, but sorry, I shouldn't say that. But yeah, I mean, great appreciation for what we do, honestly.
We won't tell.
It's being recorded, though. I'm going to try and behave myself. When I first started giving talks, I didn't quite understand what I could and couldn't say or how I had to phrase it, and I'm better at it now, but sometimes I go over the edge. Sorry. Okay, so any other comments or questions? Also, a copy of these slides will be available, so if anybody wants them, they'll be available. Yes?
Just wondering, if there is so much support, why is the budget flat across years, couple of years?
Well, I'll talk about the budget in a little bit, but the question is, why is the budget flat across multiple years? There's a saying in DC that flat is the new doubling sometimes, and you know, you could say, well, I mean, flat is better than going down. I'll say that. And you know that since 2013, for example, there have been spending constraints on caps, and so there's a lot of things that the government has to do for people, right? People have to make hard choices. So it's really, you know, constrained spending. And so, yes, science it's a priority, and really CISE is pretty well loved, but there's lots of competing things. So I'm going to actually talk about the science and priority memo and stuff like that a little bit later. So I'll actually get into how some of those decisions are made. Yes?
So would you agree that in the 70s, computer sciences was in the Renaissance period by itself, while now the innovation is at the intersection with engineering?
That's a great question.
The initiatives, brain, smart cities.
Yes, so that's a theme, and remember the title of this is sort of an expanding and an expansive view. I think computer science, 100% agree with you that in the 70s and even into the 80s and the 90s, it tended to be a more inwardly focused discipline. We were focusing more on computation, on the artifacts that we were building, the networks and the databases and the programming languages and the compilers. I think in the 80s and then into the 90s and even more now, it's become a much more outward-looking discipline, and we see intersections with lots of other different disciplines. So I agree with you 100%. Okay, so let me continue on. I want to tell you a little bit about size. I apologize, I have an org chart here. And it's really just to show you what we do, right? Not our organization itself. So within the CISE Directorate, so we're one of 7 what are called research directorates inside the National Science Foundation. We have an Office of Advanced Cyberinfrastructure. So when you hear that, you might think high performance computing. You would be right. That's here. But also data, international high-speed network research connections. I'm sure on this campus, or I would bet, you have a campus cyber infrastructure award here for connecting at high speeds into the backbone, software, networking, and security, right? So it's really cyber infrastructure broadly, not just high-performance computing. We have a division of computing and communication foundations, hardware, software, theory, algorithms, and communication and information theory. This is the easiest division to describe. It's called computer and network systems because it does computer systems and network systems. And then finally, and this is where we're seeing really a lot of the growth recently, information and intelligence systems, so the cyber-human interface, information systems, and robust intelligence is where machine learning, natural language processing, what you might call AI, is living. So that's who we are. Let me just give you some basic statistics. So Mario's told you our budget in 2017 is $936 million. That's actually the president's proposed budget for us for 2018, which we don't have yet appropriated to us, but that's the proposal. And also for 2019, and maybe it'll be higher. We have to wait to see what Congress does. If you're a faculty member, you always take a look at this number here, the success rate. So 21% acceptance rate. That's just the number of proposals that come in and the percentage of those that are funded. And I will tell you that it's sad to say, but we do leave a lot of really good proposals that we really, really want to fund. There's just not enough funding to go around. And not in any fair sense, but really high quality proposals that we're not able to fund. So we could definitely do more. So in the end, a lot of things come down to people, right? So 7,200 faculty, think faculty, senior researchers funded. I know a lot of you are graduate students. Let me see, how many people here who are graduate students are funded by NSF? You have an RA or a fellowship or? Not so many, okay, well maybe you're not all, well, okay. Now I see more hands coming up, okay, but I mean, we're just so proud. I mean, you know, students and workforce, it's the lifeblood of, right, of what's gonna happen with this country and what's gonna happen in our discipline. So we're really proud. I mean, that's a pretty sizable number of graduate students who are supported here, and a large number of undergraduates also, 2,600, primarily through the REU research experience for undergraduate program. So we talked about, you know, flat is the new doubling, so just so you know, this is what our budget looks like, and you can see really going back to, in 2009, there was a sort of a blip because of the Recovery Act, and then pretty much flat budgets, slightly increasing since then. And those are just the different divisions. So there's just one number to look at here, and that's this one up here in the corner, 83%. So when the federal government, you spend money in the federal government, you have to tag it and say, you know, this money's being used for this. And one of the tags is basic academic research. And what this graph shows you is that for computer science, 83% of all federal spending for basic academic research in computer science flows through the National Science Foundation, right? It's a big percentage and something that really is a sobering number for us, given how important we believe computer science research is for the, you know, for the country as a whole. One of my jobs, I think, is to make the pie bigger and that number smaller, right? By engaging other agencies and partnerships, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so before I talk about, oh, great.
So there was a slide, the one before, which told 21%.
Oh, yep, this
yeah.
one, yep.
So is that only computer science, or is it across the?
These are statistics just for computer science. Actually, for NSF as a whole, it's just about the same. I think it might be 22%, but it's within a percent either way.
So my question is, at least for the last few years, or last couple of years, the feeling is not 21%.
Right.
I don't know how to put it, because most of the time you call the
I've been a
program
PI for 32 years. I know exactly what you're saying.
We
Yeah.
hear like, there were 20 proposals, we funded one, or
Yeah.
that. So I'm just thinking, and this is probably a
Yeah.
data science question, where the numbers coming from, or how does it?
Right. Well, these are just, I mean, this is what the number is, right? To answer your question, I mean, I understand what you're saying 100%, and it varies from program to one program to another. So for instance, the success rate's higher, for instance, in some of our junior faculty programs, the CR, the Size Research Initiation Initiative, or Career. I mean, those are actually a little bit higher than that. There are others, big data, for instance, is one where we get a huge number and we're not able to fund nearly that kind of percentage. So, there's a distribution about that. That's just the raw numbers. Yes?
Will you show any statistics comparing how much a PI asked for in a proposal versus how much was given?
Oh, actually, so that's a great question. How much you ask for versus what you get. I don't actually know what that number is, but I will look that up. Again, that sort of speaks to this issue of unmet need and good things that we want to fund, we're not able to. I can give you a statistic that I gathered in preparation for the AI hearing that we had last week. So we fund, in core AI, we fund $122 million a year in what we would call core AI, and the sort of affiliated areas. If you were to look at proposals that get a rating of competitive or highly competitive, and so those are fundable things that we're not able to fund, that's actually $179 million. So there's a lot, again, this speaks to the issue of there's capacity, there's great things that we could do as a foundation and as a country, and we need the funding to do that. And actually, the question you asked is a great one, because that's another measure of more capacity things we could do but aren't able to. Okay. So programmatics. Okay. All right. I want to show you two one-slide slides and promote Karganakar, if you don't know him. He's your vice president for research here. He and I have served together at the National Science Foundation. He's the, sort of have my position in the engineering directorate. And 3 years ago, this was when I was just getting started, the director of NSF said to me, she said to all the ADs, we're going to have a retreat, and I want you to tell me where your field has been, what it's doing now, and where it's going, and you each have a slide, one slide to do it, okay? So here's my one slide overview that I showed Pramod and the other ADs at our retreat about computer science. And then you can tell me what you think about it. But imagine having to talk about everything an entire discipline does in one slide. So of course, it's got overlays and builds and things like that. So here it goes, okay? So we start sort of with the core, with the foundations, and these are areas. I mean, getting back to the earlier comment, you know, these are areas of computer science, many of which have been around for many, many decades. Okay, so we start with the foundations. Now, I want to sort of divide computing up into sort of 4 different areas and think about where we are now and where we're going. And certainly the entire history of computing almost has been really electrical and really built around CMOS. Okay? But if you start thinking about, well, what are people thinking about? What are people working on now? Well, certainly nano quantum computing is incredibly hot and important right now. Molecular computing, optical. And so we have this notion, think about the physicalness of computing, right? Moving on beyond sort of the electrical heritage that we have here, beyond, you know, new forms of physicalness of computing. Okay, this one over here is, when you think of computing, what is it? So for someone like Nalini here, the answer is going to be obvious, right? When me or my parents ask them, what's a computer? Well, it's a box, right? It's a laptop. You know, maybe it's one of these big ugly desktops that sits there, but there's sort of there's a box and it's a computer, right? But of course, what's really happening is that computing is being embedded all around us in smart vehicles, smart buildings. Computing is just everywhere, right? And this is sort of the vision of cyber-physical systems, swarms, you know, mobile computing embedded around us. And so this is, again, this notion of computing. I believe maybe not my kids, but my grandkids won't even know computing around them, right? Because it'll be everywhere. Okay, let's think about HCI. You might think about a mouse or a pointer or haptics or something like that, but really what we're seeing here is the evolution of sort of the physical interaction of computing to sort of really the human technology interface here. So affective computing, affective computing, computation understanding the emotions and the mental state of the people who are working with that software. Assistive technologies and robotics, social informatics, embedding silicon into neural pathways, so the mind-machine brain interface. And then finally, on the application, to come back to an earlier question, really seeing the application of computing really all across different areas of science and engineering and all areas of human endeavor. Okay, so what do you think? Okay for one slide to explain an entire discipline and 60, 70, 80 years of history? All right, not too bad. Okay, so I have one more slide. This is not one, actually this is one that I've just only showed this week. So I'd love to get people's feedback of this. People often say, where do you spend your money, right? You get $934 million, where does it go, right? Totally reasonable question. So here's a one slide answer to this. Okay, Pramod, you've not seen this, right? Okay, so here's the way to look at this. The aspect ratio is not quite right. These are supposed to be spheres, but they look more like pills. So there are different colored balls here. Different colored balls so that our core programs are the ones that are in red here. Infrastructure programs are in blue, this kind of blue. Early career, so here's our career boards right here. Here's CISE Research Initiative. I talked about both of those before. And the area of the sort of pill-shaped thing is proportional to the amount of funding that we invest there. So this is a $10 million size ball. So it goes as the area, not the volume. So somebody asked me that. I was speaking to electrical engineers, so leave it to an electrical engineer to ask a good question. They actually were thinking that it was proportional to the cube of the radius. Anyway, it's the area. So we have named research programs. So here you see secure and trustworthy cyberspace. We were talking earlier about the importance of cybersecurity research. You can see the size of the relative size and the relative importance of the investments that we make there. The National Robotics Initiative, Smart and Connected Communities, Smart and Autonomous Systems. What else should I point out here? We have some center scale activities, science and technology centers, size expeditions programs here. The green ones. The green ones are our educational activities. So here's research experience for undergraduates, broadening participation in computing. This is a program actually that we worked with Promote on called RED, Revolutionizing Engineering and Computer Science Departments. Here's computer science for all, K through 12. Here's yet more educational programs. So anyway, this was, great, comments.
A question.
Yes.
So I understand, so the funding for all of NSF is flat, okay? But given the huge increase in CS students and faculty, how is SIZE funding increasing over the years, or is it not increasing?
Well, actually, that budget slide that I showed you was the CISE Directorate, right? So NSF has been relatively flat. SIZE has been relatively flat. If you were to plot NSF and SIZE, you would see that SIZE has gone up maybe a little bit more than NSF as a whole, but you don't see sort of hockey sticking differences or anything like that.
And is that fair? I mean, given the...
Well...
So you see, what's happening is the number of faculty is increasing at a vast rate.
Right.
But the funding is not increasing.
Right, okay, so I hear you 100%. I should ask Pramod to answer this and get me off the hook, but I'll tell you a story. So I've been an administrator in universities, and there I really felt like it was somehow unjust that computer science wasn't being funded more. But honestly, when I look at all of the good things that go on with NSF. So it's true that computer science is growing, and I'll come back to that in a second. But think about understanding gravitational waves, right? 100-year effort. It costs almost $1 billion to do that, right? But for mankind, understanding gravitational waves and the origins of the universe is phenomenally important, right? So I can't point to something at NSF and say, we're better than that, because I look around and amazing things are happening in all of the directorates, right? I mean, I really do believe that. I didn't believe that in some of my academic administrative positions, but I believe that at NSF. So let me come back to the question that it's true that the size of the discipline is growing. And what I don't do is I don't try to make the case for increased funding on that basis. I talk about it in terms of opportunity, right? It's growing, yes, it's growing, but it's growing because of opportunity, right? That I think, and it's not just that we have growing student populations, right? It's growing because there are research intersections between computer science and so many other disciplines. So I think of it as an opportunity. It's because of opportunity that we're growing, and not that the growth in itself is important.
But some of the measures are subjective. Is going to Mars important? Well, maybe it is, right? But some of the measures are quite objective. How many what's the increase in the faculty?
Right, but you can't. Well, we can take this offline. But honestly, just because the faculty are going up, that in and of itself is not a reason to increase funding, right? It's not that. I think that would be a very dangerous argument to be making, right? Because faculty go up and down, and those of us who've been around long enough know about AI winters and AI summers, for example. And you have to have sustained long-term investment. And I think you make the case more on opportunity than numbers of people, because I don't think, especially since with Congress, I don't think that because there are people that just means somehow you're entitled to that. I think you've got to really make the case. So I make it on that basis. I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to get to partnerships in the end and building partnerships with industry, because I think that for much like an educational institution, for NSF, that's an opportunity. We've done a lot of partnering with industry over the last 3 or 4 years. So 2 questions.
Yes, I guess I would translate the question as, if faculty's doubling, how's that supposed to work, right? Which is, if you believe that the numbers are indicative of, like, sort of feeding the economy and feeding people into the computing industry, and that's valuable for the country, how do we make that possible given, like, flat funding and, sort of, universities going, well,
Yep.
you don't have a grant, and so you're not gonna stay, and so.
Right. So again, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I remember a conversation you and I had a little over 3 years ago about exactly that in industry. And I am going to talk
So you
about
get
that
to
because
that.
I think that industry and understanding how important the educational ecosystem is for industry and helping industry partner with government to make sure that that is vibrant, we're not eating our seed corn, all those kinds of things are something that I'm actually working very actively on.
Jim, maybe
Okay.
I can offer one
Oh, great.
perspective that will be, it won't answer your question, it won't answer the fairness question. But the fact of the matter is, SIZE budget is $930 million. It's pretty close to engineering budget. And engineering as a field and as faculty size is significantly larger on any campus. So what that proves to me is two things. One, I think on a relative basis, SIZE has done well at NSF over the last 20 years. But in absolute terms, government or Congress has not funded basic academic research at the same level in science and engineering as, for example, in health. So NIH gets increases every year, almost without asking. In Alzheimer's, they will put more money than NIH asks for. And I think the national community has not spoken to congressmen and congresswomen to say that if you don't fund basic science and engineering research, our economic competitiveness is at risk. That argument has not been made with the same force.
So actually, if you'd like to delve more into this, the director of NSF testified yesterday about the 2019 budget before the House Science Committee, and exactly that point is made. And you will see from Congress a lot of concern about the levels of investment in some areas, in particular AI and quantum, that other countries are making, and are we matching that? So it's absolutely part of the discussion, maybe at a level that's a lot more intense than it was a couple of years ago, which would be a great thing. Yes?
I was going to comment that maybe you want to discuss it later. I think the corporations and perhaps some of these billionaires should do a more proactive job of funding. And I think this MUD is very good in UCI of funding chairs, but more of the bigger companies like the Oracle, Google, and Microsoft need to step in and fill in the 5% that should be going to their
Right. So
R&D.
I'll actually give you some of the statistics and some of the things that we're trying to do with
And I think
partnerships.
with the new tax laws, so instead of funding CEO pay, they should be funding more research.
Okay, I know that's a question I need to walk away from, but I hear you, okay? Yes.
So one thing I think, just this slide, I
Yes.
was wondering, within the core areas like CCF, IIS,
Right.
What is the distribution of the different sub-directorates?
Well, so these are the three divisions here, and so you can see they're essentially, proportionally, they're about the same. They're about
I'm
200
talking
million
about
each.
within each of them, like, within IIS, there's robust intelligence.
Oh,
that may be something interesting for actually grassroots faculty to look at.
Oh,
So just
okay.
a comment on that.
I've got the data on that, not in this particular slide deck, but for IIS, I've got that completely down, but just not with me, sorry, but I hear what you're saying. I only got one slide here, right, so I couldn't then break it down to all of the different pieces of the core. Okay, so I hope that's okay in terms of a one-slide answer to where do we spend our funding. Yes?
What was the number in dollars for the total NSF budget?
The entire NSF budget is $7.5 billion. And the size budget and the engineering budget are both around $930 million. Right? The largest two directorates are math and physical sciences. I want to say they're around 1.4 billion, and geosciences. And there's a lot of infrastructure there, which is one of the reasons they're so big. Okay, I tell you what I'm going to do, because I do, and the conversation is great. So I'm going to skip through. I could tell you about programs we're doing, but you can read about those programs on the web, right? So I'm going to skip forward, I was going to talk about harnessing the data revolution. Cybersecurity is always important. The human technology frontier, I'm going to talk about this in a slightly different. And I'll leave these slides behind so you can read about, these are, what I'm just doing is showing some of the different programmatics and solicitations that we have out. Okay? And I knew there were AI people here who would be interested in this. We could talk about that afterwards. I want to say a couple words about education, and then I want to talk about the big ideas, because this is something new that we're unveiling we hope to unveil in fiscal 2019. It's in the president's budget. I want to say a couple words about computer science education because it's so important and because I think we have really, really moved the needle here in a way I'm so proud. Okay? So about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, we started a program called CS10K. The goal was to get 10,000 trained teachers in K through 12, and there was a few hundred at the time who had gone through professional development. I was a faculty member. I got approached by NSF to volunteer for that. I did. I told them I thought they were totally nuts, that how are you ever going to do that? I've worked in the state of Massachusetts on education. There's 404 school districts, right? That's, you go to visit one school district a day on weekends, and you still don't get to visit every district in one state in 1 year, right? So how do you make change in education at scale? And here's the beautiful thing that, I mean, it was a real stroke of genius from a program director. She started working with the computer science, on a new computer science AP exam. So we have computer science A exam. There was a new exam called Computer Science Principles. It focuses more on the creative use of computing and the application of computing. It's a little bit of programming, but it's more about foundations and creative use. And this is what she said, or figured out. We'll go to the College Board. We actually funded the College Board. We funded faculty in universities, faculty in high schools to work on curricular frameworks for this new exam. And that by doing it through the College Board, the school systems would pull it in, right? And we'd provide, we spend a lot of funding on professional development training for teachers as well. But the key thing was you didn't have to push it, it would be pulled in, okay? So this exam was offered for the first time last spring. 55,000 students took the exam in the first year. That blew the previous record for the largest launch of an AP exam by the College Board out of the water. And even more importantly, the demographics of the students who took it. African American participation went from 4% to 7%. Latino participation went from 11 to 20%. Female participation went from 22 to 30%. And you know, this is called Computer Science for All, and that for all in both in terms of access and equity was a really important part of putting this together. So it's just something, I mean, I can't take credit for it, but I'm incredibly proud. It's like, you know, you score a run because you were born on third base. So, and someone hit the ball behind you, so you just sort of ran across the plate. So, you know, we're doing great things there. The other thing I'll point out is that, you know, we've been working with the Engineering Directorate. I mentioned the RED program before, and this year we're going to be spinning out a separate program on Computer Science plus X. In many ways, this is bringing coals to Newcastle here, right? Because this is a university where, you know, computing is very outward facing, and you folks do this at all already, and not everybody does. So I want to go to the end of my talk, and then I'm going to come back here, because I know your provost has to take off in just a second. And I wanted to show, I do want to talk about education, and then I'll come back. Oh, okay, all right. So you're living this, but I want to stress what I think are going to be the educational challenges that this campus, and really you're out in front of most campuses, but that you're going to face. So is the undergraduate program director for, I see it here? Okay, well, it's the unsung superhero, he or she, right? So here's the undergraduate program director standing up to the wave of students who I know are coming into your classes, right? And this is my university, the University of Massachusetts. When we became a college, or wanted to become a college, we showed this graph of enrollments to our chancellor at the time, and the chancellor said, wow, that's impressive. He's a really smart guy. And he said, well, I noticed the periodicity here, and it's going to turn over, and I can figure out when it's going to turn over. And then he said, but I know what you want me to do, right? You want me to say, oh, the trend's increasing, so I should be continuing my investment that they've been making all along. And we just pointed out to him that actually that a quadratic was a way better fit, and that they should be investing exponentially in us, not just linearly in us. And we did become a college, and that was great. And you can't go up exponentially forever, but I think across the country, we do see these kinds of exponential growths in students. And again, it's not just students. The students represent opportunity, right? The students are there because of opportunity, so it's not just numbers. So I think when we talk about this kind of explosive interest in computer science, it does seem different this time around. So there's a National Academy study that just came out about 2 months ago about the undergraduate numbers and experience in computer science that I should have put a reference to it on, but it talks about this notion about the interests of students coming in being broader, the emphasis on minors, and people coming in from other disciplines to take computer science courses here. So, kudos to your undergraduate program director here for the great work he or she does. I think the bad news for your undergraduate program director, well, actually, this gets to a question that sort of Mike brought up here. We have increasing program size. This is what keeps me up at night, quite honestly, right? So increasing faculty size, we talked about the investments, additional grant pressures, things like that. So, I think Pramod mentioned NIH. There's a really interesting article. If you want to think sort of in a macro sense about what happens to disciplines, there was a proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. There's like a Princeton president here and Nobel Prize winner here. So these are really like high-powered, good-thinking people talking about what happened with NIH when their funding was actually in a doubling phase, and then it sort of flattened out. And what happened there when you see this kind of growth, but you can't support that growth from a research standpoint. Okay. So I want to get back to your undergraduate program director here, who's been doing a yeoman's job here. And I think here's the bad news for your undergraduate program director, right? And this actually gets back to the computer science principles exam that I was talking about, right? That I believe that our campuses are going to be seeing sort of this second tsunami of students coming in, that they're coming through computer science principles and they're interested in the application of computing, right? And they show up on your campus and they say, I love computer science. It's a diverse set of students and we want to keep them. And then we say, oh, great. You want to study computer science? Take CS1, CS2, discrete math, computer organization. I'm not saying you do it here, right? But I have seen places where this happens still. And that maybe when you're a junior and a senior, you can really sort of blossom and do what you want. And I think what we're really trying to do with our RED investments that we've made and the new Computer Science Plus X investments that we're going to be making starting this year is really to encourage departments to think about multiple pathways through their major and a way to capture those students who don't sort of fit the mold of the great students that we're doing. So we will continue to do what we've always done with our traditional majors, and our students get gobbled up and they do great jobs and do good things. Industry loves them, but there is this other set of students who are not addressed by, and again, I don't know enough about your programmatics here, but in general, some of the programmatics on campuses.
Sorry, are you suggesting starting some kind of an honors track?
No, it's not so much of an honors track. I think it's more, I'll give you an example of a program that I've always tried to sort of push on my faculty at UMass, and that's the Georgia Tech Threads model, right? That it's not sort of a one-size-fits-all CS1, CS2, but that you've got sets of courses and students can sort of pick their own pathways through it. And if you happen to be a little more applied or you have interests over here, you can go through a major this way as opposed to sort of a major this way. So it's really not, it's not about working with honors students differently. It's about giving more choices and more pathways through majors. And that's a hard thing to do given that your courses are already filled and overflowing. I mean, that's the real challenge that we face now.
Jim, has anybody looked at the BLS projections that you showed us, 55% jobs going to computer occupations, and how that maps into this flow of students, and is the educational system going to kind of serve them well?
I wish we could turn off the recording because I'd ask you all a question. Well, I can ask you the question, right? So I will say that at UMass we've had experience with companies that have come in and want to partner with us on curriculum that they think would be great for us to teach for students who would come out and work for them. Very seldom have I actually seen faculty get up and walk out of a room because they felt insulted, but at least in one case that happened. And so I guess my very narrow experience is that that hasn't worked well to date, trying especially at an R1 university. I think there may be places where that's very important to do that. That community colleges tend to work very closely with local employers because it's important to match the students coming out there. But for a place like UCI, I think I'd argue you really want to teach people broadly and as opposed to, say, more narrowly focused to track them into something. But anybody got a comment? Yes?
Actually, we have 7 majors, undergraduate majors.
Right, I know you've got 7 majors here.
Variants of computer science to cater to the breadth of computing interests.
So would you say that you folks have this covered here?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to look at it and see if that's the case. But I mean, I knew about the 7 majors here, and again, I said it's a little bit like bringing coals to Newcastle here because I know that there's a long history here of being very outward facing. Yeah.
Just to add more detail to what Gopi said, our main CS major has tracks, so there are actually many different paths to the same CS major, but it's a point well taken anyways.
No. Well, so Brent, I don't know the details here, and I think schools are thinking about this, and maybe I should start using UCI instead of Georgia Tech as the model. I mean, some schools are really out. It sounds like you're really out in front of this, and that's great. Yeah. Okay. So I want to go backwards, but I promise I'll finish up in 5 minutes here, right? Because there's been a lot of discussion. Actually, I want to do 2 quick things here. I want to tell you about the big ideas because it's important that you know about them. And then I want to talk about partnerships, and then I'm done. Okay? So 2 years ago, the director of NSF, Franz Cordova, and actually this came out in another one of our AD retreats, assistant director retreats, this notion of the big ideas. Okay? And there were 6 sort of research areas: harnessing the data revolution, work at the human technology frontier, navigating the new Arctic, multi-messenger astrophysics, rules of life, and quantum, that NSF identified as areas where investment would have maybe higher than average marginal return. This is the time to be making investments in these areas. We had some process ideas, mid-scale, growing convergence research, and STEM diversity here. And this is what our director said: bold questions that will drive NSF's long-term research agenda, questions that ensure future generations continue to reap the benefits of fundamental science and engineering research. So she later said, actually last year, I know there are a bunch of AI people, so I wanted to include this quote. Sometimes we help the director write some of her remarks. This was not one of those cases, right? So she emailed me. This was a very prestigious named lecture she gave at the National Institutes of Health. And she wrote me one week and she said, I've been thinking about AI, and really it's the universal connector behind everything. And so this is what she put in her speech, which, when your boss says things that you believe, it's good time. AI is the universal connector that interweaves through all of our big ideas: data science changing the nature of scientific inquiry, and AI's use of data having the potential to revolutionize everything that we do. So this is just sort of by way of background on the big ideas. Let me tell you that in the fiscal 19 budget, there's $30 million set aside for each of these big ideas, right? Which is a wonderful thing. That's separate from all the other things that we're doing, and that these are now being sort of allocated across directorates to groups that cross directorates, different from sort of the organizational boundaries that we have, to do new things here. And that's sort of a new experiment here. Like most universities have institutes. You can think of these almost as mini institutes. here's where they are. I'm going to talk just quickly about 3, harnessing the data revolution. We have a lot of activities here on the theoretical aspects, transdisciplinary research and principles of data science. I don't know if there are any tripods funded people here. We have a new solicitation that came out 2 days ago on tripods plus X, so taking mathematicians, statisticians, and computer scientists and pairing them in a discipline, X, which that could be any. Other activities here. Educational pathways, I talked about. Well, this is a different National Academy study on the undergraduate perspective for data science, and then finally mid-scale cyber infrastructure. We also have a big idea on work at the human technology frontier. This is something I hear about a lot for this group here. Actually, probably all of these, given the particular research interests here, would be of interest to people. You'll see solicitations coming out later this year. Matter of fact, there's a new one that came out a week ago on augmenting human performance, cognition, and physical capabilities. And then you'll see more broader ones coming out later this calendar year. And then finally, quantum. I'm not quite sure the level of interest here or capacity in quantum, but I can tell you that certainly in this House Science Committee here, there's tremendous amount of interest and discussions about really doing something at a national level here. Okay, and then finally, in addition to the big ideas, taking a couple of them, actually 2 of them, and additionally creating an accelerator. So this is sort of more in the DARPA mode of activities with sort of nearer term deliverables, probably partnering with industry in harnessing the data revolution and work at the human technology frontier. And all of these are actually contained in the more detailed NSF budget that we released. Okay, so the last thing, since I already talked about education, I just want to say a word about partnerships since they've come up, right? And I'll just talk about industry partnerships, and then I promise, I'll be done here. In the last 3 years, or 3.5 years, we in CISE, actually, in some cases with engineering, have partnered with industry on solicitations. So I know some people here have applied to some of the joint solicitations we've done with Intel, 5 of them. So it's a regular solicitation. If you're a PI, well, you can, with some of them you can opt in. You just say, oh, I'm just interested in the NSF part, or I'm interested in both parts. We've done 8 solicitations with Semiconductor Research Corporation and 2 with VMware. We've partnered with cloud providers for platforms for advanced wireless research, about 50 million of NSF money, 50 million from a wireless consortium of companies. We've partnered with cloud providers for about 12 million, I guess, here. And then these are some of the programs we've had all along, like IUCRCs, industry-university research collaborations. Okay, so I won't go through those. Let me just say, well, just to sort of look at the bottom line numbers here, about $100 million coming in from industry, matched by 156 million from, I guess, CISE in this case. Okay. So that's it. I could talk about international partnerships. You saw this. I'm glad I really wanted your provost to see this. So. I think Pramod had already seen this. So, and tell your program director that she or he is a hero. So let me close up. Let me close up just by saying that this sort of gets back to this question we were talking about at the very beginning. There's a huge amount of interest in computer science. Within the federal government, every year the federal government writes, or I should say the president, the office of the president, writes a priority memo. Here's some text from it. What are the research and development priorities? Autonomous systems, machine learning, quantum computing, interagency initiative, STEM education, including computer science education. So that sounds good to me. It sounds really good to me. There's a national security strategy here. And then I've mentioned several times, there are hearings. This is Congress's way of saying, hey, this is something we're interested in. Science infrastructure, which includes cyber infrastructure, computer science education, multiple panels on artificial intelligence, and one on quantum fairly recently here. So That's it. So we can all feel like Forrest Gump, right? That it really is an amazing time to be in computer science. It does seem, I don't know, yeah, it's physically everywhere, but it just seems interesting. Computer science is everywhere. We have so many communities that we engage in with industry, with local government, federal government, and there's an urgency. I don't know. I feel like we've got to do, there's so many things to do that we've got to keep moving. Things are expanding so quickly, and there's so much opportunity, as I've said many times. Okay, so just one last request. Pramod will tell you, I will tell you, working with NSF is a wonderful thing. Working at NSF is a wonderful thing. Pramod and I were both what were called rotators. We go in, we work for a few years, we go back to our institutions or another institution, I guess. It's a great experience, so please consider getting involved. There's ways to get involved. Consider joining us as a program officer or division director. Okay, and with that, as always, it's great to come to UCI. Great to see so many people that I know here, and just it's always wonderful to visit. So thank you again.
Maybe one last question
Okay.
for Jim, otherwise we are ready to break.
So when you think of science and engineering in general, I mean, there's many ways to measure impact, and one of them is the economy and, you
Right.
know, but there's sort of this longer term way in which, message in which, you brought up gravitational science, and there's different ways to measure the impact of different areas over time. And in some sense, computing has sort of infiltrated across all of these areas, starting from the days of scientific computing, where
Right.
lots of basic science, the gravitational stuff that you mentioned, has been facilitated by computing research. And in that bubble diagram that you showed, there's a lot of interdisciplinarity
Right,
that is
absolutely.
embedded in there, right?
Right.
And so is it really that number is just size, or is it like across several?
Well, all the numbers I showed are just the size budgets for a lot of the
But something like
solicitations that we have. Multiple directorates are coming and putting in their pots of money into that too,
I
right?
see.
Right.
But
So, yeah.
for example, when you take SCH or if you take CPS, there's usually another component with every
Right.
bundle that's being.
Right. So for Smart Connected Health, SCH, or Cyber Physical Systems, CPS, not only are there other directorates involved, so engineering partners with us, and social behavioral and economic sciences, but NIH on CPS, agriculture, DOD, NASA on robotics, so that we are bringing in, and that's not counted actually, the money coming in from other, from other agencies, right? And the budget numbers I showed you again were just size numbers. They didn't include total expenditures in, say, solicitations and areas that we collaborate with others on, which is many. Right.
Yeah, I guess the point was that is actually going out to other areas as well.
Well, it does go out. I mean, certainly, there are people who are not in size, units, say, on campus that are funded with size money, but that's true also about, there are size people funded from SBE, and by, I was a PI on an engineering research center, right? And I was a computer scientist. So I think those disciplinary boundaries, actually, when we were talking about the big ideas, when we were talking about what does it mean to be interdisciplinary research, one of the things we all agreed on as a principle was that somewhat random organizational boundaries inside the National Science Foundation should not define what it means to be interdisciplinary. So that means just because you're from, I think, take social, behavioral, and economic sciences, right? A psychologist and an economist or an anthropologist, that's interdisciplinary even though they're in one directorate, right? So in many ways, SCISE used to be part of math and physical sciences, I think. And, so organizational boundaries change, and So we try not to pay too much attention to it.
It's hard to draw those kinds of diagrams.
It is,
because
right,
that
in a meaningful way, yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay, thanks.